September 1964. Albany, New York breathes with post-war confidence. Tree-lined streets shelter modest homes where neighbors know each other's names. Catherine Blackburn, 50 years old, walks the same route to Mohawk Brush Company each morning. Her Colony Street apartment holds the quiet rhythm of a woman who has made peace with solitude. But peace shatters when evil finds an unlocked door. When Catherine fails to answer her co-worker's knock, worry spreads like ripples in still water. Her sister arrives. Her niece, Sandy Carmichael, follows. Inside, they discover brutality that will haunt a city for 61 years. Catherine lies murdered, beaten, stabbed, burned with heated knives from her own kitchen. No forced entry, no robbery, only a handkerchief beneath her body and a false name on a rent receipt. The killer vanishes into autumn air, leaving behind questions that time cannot answer. Until science remembers what memory forgot. What happens when the past refuses to stay buried? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The morning air carried the crisp promise of September in Albany. The year was 1964, and the city hummed with the steady confidence of post-war America. Factory whistles marked the hours, and neighbors still waved from front porches. On Colony Street, the rhythm of ordinary life continued unchanged, unaware that evil had already visited in the night. Catherine Blackburn's co-worker stood outside the modest apartment building, shifting weight from one foot to the other. 7:30 had come and gone. Catherine was never late for work at Mohawk Brush Company, where she supervised the factory floor with quiet authority. The locked front door stared back, offering no explanation for her absence. Down the street, children walked to school with lunch pails swinging. The September sky stretched pale blue above the North Albany neighborhood, where families had settled into comfortable routines. Life moved forward with the assumption that tomorrow would mirror today. Safety lived in familiarity, but Catherine Blackburn would not answer her door today, or ever again. The co-worker knocked again, harder this time. The sound echoed through the hallway, followed by silence that felt heavier than it should. Worry began its slow crawl up the spine, the kind of unease that starts small but refuses to be ignored. Catherine was reliable. Catherine was punctual. Catherine answered her door, unless something was wrong. By 11 o'clock, the worry had spread beyond one concerned co-worker. Catherine's sister arrived with Sandy Carmichael, her young niece, whose world still believed in simple explanations for complicated problems. They had come to check, to reassure, to find Catherine sick in bed with fever or fallen asleep past her alarm. The landlord produced keys with hands that trembled slightly. The door swung open to reveal a scene that would burn itself into Sandy's memory forever. Catherine lay motionless on the floor, her body bearing wounds that spoke of deliberate cruelty. Blood pooled beneath her, dark and final. Sandy's scream shattered the morning quiet. Neighbors emerged from their apartments, drawn by the sound of grief discovering itself. The sister collapsed against the doorframe, her legs unable to support the weight of what her eyes had seen. This was not illness. This was not accident. This was evil, pure and purposeful, visiting their safe world. The police arrived within minutes, their squad cars disturbing the peaceful street with urgent sirens. Officers secured the scene, their faces grim as they surveyed the apartment. Catherine had been beaten with a blunt object, stabbed multiple times, and sexually assaulted. But the cruelty went beyond even that. Her killer had heated knives on her own stove and burned her flesh, leaving marks that spoke of torture rather than simple murder. There was no forced entry, no signs of struggle near the door. Catherine had known her killer, or at least trusted him enough to let him inside. Detective sergeants moved through Catherine's apartment with methodical precision, photographing every angle, cataloging every item that might hold a clue. The afternoon sun slanted through windows that had witnessed unspeakable violence, casting long shadows across the crime scene. The rent receipt changed everything. Found among Catherine's papers, it bore the signature Robert Broadhead, a name that meant nothing to her family or friend. The handwriting differed from Catherine's careful script, suggesting a potential tenant who had visited recently, perhaps the last person to see her alive. But Robert Broadhead existed nowhere in Albany's records. No address, no telephone listing, no employer. The name was a ghost, a fiction created by someone who understood the value of anonymity. The detective in charge studied the receipt under the desk lamp, hoping the paper itself might reveal secrets the ink would not surrender. Outside, reporters had gathered on Colony Street. The story was already spreading through the city's neighborhoods. A sadistic killer had struck in broad daylight, torturing an innocent woman in her own home. Fear began its slow infection of the community. If Catherine Blackburn could be murdered so brutally with no one hearing her screams, how safe was anyone? The Albany Times-Union would run the headline, "Sex Maniac Strikes," above a photograph photograph of Catherine's apartment building. The words would fuel nightmares and lock doors that had never needed locking before. Beneath Catherine's body, almost overlooked in the chaos of evidence collection, lay a handkerchief. The detective lifted it carefully, noting the fabric's quality and the absence of any obvious stains. It seemed insignificant, perhaps dropped during the struggle, perhaps belonging to Catherine herself. The handkerchief went into an evidence bag, labeled and logged, then stored in a box that would gather dust for decades. In 1964, DNA was science fiction. Forensic analysis meant fingerprints and blood types. The handkerchief held secrets that technology could not yet unlock. The Albany County Coroner's Office operated with the grim efficiency of a place where death was routine business. But Catherine Blackburn's autopsy revealed violence that shocked even experienced medical examiners. The wounds had been inflicted with calculated cruelty, designed to maximize suffering rather than ensure quick death. The coroner's report painted a picture of prolonged torture. Catherine had been struck on the head with a blunt object, then stabbed multiple times with kitchen knives. The burn marks on her body told the story of knives heated on her own stove, then pressed against her flesh while she was still alive. The sexual assault had occurred during or after the torture, adding violation to agony. The cause of death was blood loss from the stab wounds, but Catherine had endured much before she died. Her killer had taken his time, savoring her suffering. This was not a crime of passion or sudden rage. This was the work of someone who enjoyed inflicting pain. The newspapers seized on every detail, turning Catherine's final moments into tabloid entertainment. Sadistic killer loose in Albany screamed across front pages. Women began checking their locks twice, walking in groups, eyeing strangers with new suspicion. The city's sense of security had been shattered by one man's capacity for evil. Weeks passed in fruitless pursuit of Robert Broadhead. Detectives canvassed every hotel, rooming house, and rental agency in Albany. They checked employment records, voter registrations, and military files. The name appeared nowhere. It was as if the man had materialized to kill Catherine Blackburn, then vanished back into nothingness. The investigation consumed hundreds of hours and dozens of officers. Every known sex offender in the county was questioned, their alibis checked and rechecked. Neighbors were interviewed repeatedly, their memories probed for any detail that might provide a lead. The search expanded to surrounding counties, then neighboring states. But Robert Broadhead remained a phantom. Public pressure mounted as fear gripped the community. City council meetings drew crowds demanding action. Women organized safety patrols. Self-defense classes filled to capacity. The mayor promised additional police patrols, but promises could not catch a killer who had seemingly vanished into thin air. The Albany Police Department worked the case with desperate intensity, knowing that each passing day made success less likely. Evidence grows cold, memories fade, witnesses move away or die. The trail that might have led to Catherine's killer was already growing faint. Time has a way of burying even the most shocking crimes beneath layers of new tragedies and fresh concerns. By 1970, Catherine Blackburn's murder had faded from the front pages. The file moved from active investigation to cold case storage, joining dozens of other unsolved mysteries in the Albany Police Department's archives. The evidence boxes went into storage, their contents carefully cataloged and sealed. Photographs, witness statements, and physical evidence, including the handkerchief found beneath Catherine's body, were preserved according to proper procedure. The detectives who had worked the case moved on to new assignments or retirement, carrying the weight of unsolved failure with them. The years passed. The 1970s brought new crimes, new investigations, new failures, and successes. Catherine's case was consulted occasionally when similar murders occurred, but no connections emerged. The killer, whoever he was, had either died, moved away, or learned to contain his violent impulses. Sandy Carmichael grew up carrying the weight of her aunt's murder. She married, had children, built a life shadowed by unanswered questions. At family gatherings, when old stories were told, Catherine's name would surface like a ghost, bringing silence to the room. The murder had become part of the family's DNA, passed down through generations of whispered conversations and half-explained fears. The handkerchief remained in its evidence bag, its secrets locked within fibers that would not surrender their truth for another 40 years. Detective Melissa Morey had always been drawn to puzzles, and the Albany Police Department's cold case files represented the most challenging puzzles of all. In the summer of 2018, she received permission to review unsolved homicides from the 1960s and 1970s, looking for cases that might benefit from modern forensic techniques. The Blackburn file caught her attention immediately. The brutality of the crime, the methodical evidence collection, and the complete absence of viable suspects created a perfect storm of investigative frustration. But what intrigued Maury most was a note in the evidence log, handkerchief with potential biological material. In 1964, that note had meant nothing. Blood types could be determined, but individual identification was impossible. DNA analysis was decades away from invention, but in 2018, the note represented possibility. Microscopic traces of skin cells, saliva, or other biological material might have survived on the fabric, preserved in the cool darkness of the evidence vault. Maury pulled the evidence box and examined its contents under fluorescent lights. The handkerchief looked ordinary white cotton, machine-hemmed edges, no distinctive markings. But under magnification, she could see darker spots that might represent biological material. The fabric had been stored properly, sealed away from contamination. The possibility energized her. Catherine Blackburn had been dead for 54 years, but her killer might have left his calling card in place, microscopic form. Science had advanced far beyond what those 1964 detectives could have imagined. DNA could now be extracted from the smallest samples, analyzed, and compared against massive databases. The past might finally surrender its secrets. Russell Sage College's Criminal Investigation Resource Center occupied a modest building on the Troy campus, but its reputation extended far beyond the Hudson Valley. Dr. Christina Lane had built the center into a nationally recognized facility where students worked alongside law enforcement on real cases, applying cutting-edge forensic techniques to unsolved crimes. When Detective Maury called about the Blackburn case, Dr. Lane immediately understood the potential. The handkerchief represented exactly the kind of preserved evidence that modern DNA analysis could unlock. The collaboration between academia and law enforcement had produced remarkable results in similar cases. The partnership formed quickly. Dr. Lane's students would assist in re-examining all physical evidence from the case, while Maury provided police resources and legal authority. The handkerchief would be the primary focus, but every item would be scrutinized with modern forensic techniques. The first step was proper documentation. Every photograph was digitized, every report transcribed into computer databases. The evidence chain of custody was verified from 1964 to the present day. Dr. Lane insisted on meticulous procedure. Any results would be meaningless if the evidence integrity could be questioned. Local media picked up the story of students helping to solve cold cases. The articles generated public interest and some criticism from those who questioned whether college students should be handling sensitive police evidence. But Dr. Lane's reputation and the students' obvious dedication gradually won community support. The handkerchief went into a sterile container, ready for the journey to Texas and a laboratory that could read secrets written in DNA. Othram Laboratories in Conroe, Texas, specialized in the impossible, extracting usable DNA from evidence that other labs had declared hopeless. Using advanced techniques and specialized equipment, Othram scientists could recover genetic material from samples decades old, weathered by time and contamination. The handkerchief from Catherine Blackburn's murder scene presented typical challenges for a 54-year-old sample. The fabric had been stored properly, but time itself was the enemy. DNA degrades naturally, breaking down into smaller and smaller fragments until nothing useful remains. But Othram's vacuum swab technique could recover microscopic traces that conventional methods missed. The technicians worked with fragments so small they were barely detectable, using proprietary amplification methods to build usable genetic profiles from the molecular remnants of the past. 3 weeks after the handkerchief arrived in Texas, Othram called Detective Maury with extraordinary news. They had recovered a partial male DNA profile from the fabric. The sample was degraded but sufficient for comparison against genetic databases. After 54 years of silence, Catherine Blackburn's killer had finally left his signature. The DNA profile went immediately into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, searching for matches among convicted offenders. But the real breakthrough would come from genetic genealogy, comparing the profile against public ancestry databases where millions of people had voluntarily submitted their DNA to trace family histories. The killer had made a fatal mistake in 1964. He had left microscopic traces of himself on a handkerchief, never imagining that science would someday be able to read his genetic fingerprint and follow it back through his family tree. The genetic genealogy results pointed toward one extended family with roots in eastern New York. The DNA profile from the handkerchief shared significant markers with several individuals who had submitted samples to public ancestry databases, creating a family tree that stretched back generations. At the center of the genealogical web was a man named Joseph Stanley Nowakowski, born in the early 1930s and deceased since 1998. His estimated age and geographic location during the 1960s made him a perfect match for the unknown perpetrator of Catherine Blackburn's murder. Detective Maury began building Nowakowski's criminal history, and what she found chilled her. His record stretched back to teenage burglary charges in 1950, escalating through weapons violations and break-ins. In 1966, just 2 years after Catherine's murder, he had been arrested for burglary. In 1973, he had attacked a 74-year-old woman with a hatchet, nearly killing her in an assault that mirrored the brutality of Catherine's murder. The pattern was unmistakable: a predator who preferred vulnerable victims, who used weapons of convenience, who derived satisfaction from causing pain. The 1973 assault had sent him to prison, but by then he had been free for 9 years after killing Catherine. How many other victims might there have been during those years? Journalists began investigating Nowakowski's background, interviewing former neighbors and relatives. The picture that emerged was of a charming but volatile man who drank heavily and had difficulty maintaining steady employment. Several people remembered him living in the Albany area during the 1960s, though none could recall specific addresses or dates. The genetic evidence was compelling, but not conclusive. To definitively prove that Joseph Stanley Nowakowski had murdered Catherine Blackburn, investigators would need a direct DNA sample from his remains. They would have to dig up his grave. The legal process for exhumation required careful navigation through WADO, complex statutes and ethical considerations. District Attorney Lee Kinlan assembled a team of prosecutors to prepare the necessary petitions, while Detective Maury coordinated with the medical examiner's office and cemetery officials. The case for exhumation was strong. The genetic genealogy evidence provided probable cause, supported by Nowakowski's criminal history and geographic presence in Albany during 1964. The laboratory chain of custody was impeccable, with documentation tracing the handkerchief from the crime scene to the present day. But public opinion was divided. Some residents supported the pursuit of justice for Catherine Blackburn, regardless of the time elapsed. Others questioned the morality of disturbing graves to solve old crimes, arguing that both victim and perpetrator deserved to rest in peace. Religious leaders offered varying perspectives. Some emphasized the importance of truth and justice, while others focused on respect for the deceased and the finality of death. Legal scholars debated the precedent such exhumations might set for future cold cases. The Albany County Court ultimately granted the exhumation order, finding that the public interest in solving Catherine Blackburn's murder outweighed concerns about disturbing Nowakowski's remains. The procedure would be conducted with dignity and respect, following established protocols for forensic exhumation. The date was set for dawn on a Tuesday morning at Albany Rural Cemetery, when foot traffic would be minimal and media attention could be controlled. The morning mist clung to the headstones at Albany Rural Cemetery as the forensic team assembled around Joseph Stanley Nowakowski's grave. The work proceeded with clinical precision, guided by court orders and scientific protocol. A backhoe carefully removed the soil while anthropologists documented each step of the process. Nowakowski's coffin emerged intact, its metal surfaces oxidized but structurally sound. The remains inside were well preserved, protected by the sealed environment and the cool, stable temperature of the grave. Forensic specialists removed a small bone sample, sufficient for DNA extraction, while leaving the skeleton largely undisturbed. The sample went immediately to the laboratory in a chain of custody that would satisfy any legal challenge. Within days, technicians had extracted nuclear DNA from the bone marrow and compared it to the profile from the handkerchief. The results left no room for doubt. Joseph Stanley Nowakowski had murdered Catherine Blackburn in September 1964. The news conference was scheduled for the following day, but word leaked quickly through law enforcement channels. By evening, reporters had gathered outside Albany Police Headquarters, ready to document the end of a 61-year mystery. Sandy Carmichael received the call at home, her voice trembling as Detective Maury explained the results. After more than 6 decades of unanswered questions, her aunt's killer finally had a name and a face. The relief was overwhelming, mixed with grief for all the years of uncertainty that could never be recovered. Catherine Blackburn's murder was no longer a mystery. It was a solved case with a dead perpetrator who could never be brought to trial. Chief Brendan Cox stood behind the podium at Albany Police Headquarters, facing a room crowded with reporters, city officials, and members of Catherine Blackburn's family. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, illuminating faces eager for answers that had been 61 years in coming. Today, we can finally say that Catherine Blackburn's murder has been solved, Chief Cox announced, through the dedication of Detective Melissa Maury, the scientific expertise of Dr. Christina Lane and her students at Russell Sage College, and the advanced DNA analysis performed by Othram Laboratories, we have identified Catherine's killer as Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. The room buzzed with questions. How had the DNA survived so long? Why hadn't Nowakowski been suspected earlier? What other cases might be connected to him? Chief Cox methodically addressed each question, emphasizing the meticulous scientific process that had led to the identification. The DNA match was definitive, he explained. The chain of custody for the handkerchief evidence had been maintained continuously since 1964. Nowakowski's criminal history showed a pattern of escalating violence that culminated in the brutal 1973 assault on an elderly woman, an attack that shared disturbing similarities with Catherine's murder. District Attorney Lee Kinlon praised the collaboration between law enforcement, academia, and private laboratories as a model for solving cold cases. The Blackburn investigation had demonstrated that no case was too old, no evidence too degraded for modern forensic science to unlock. For Sandy Carmichael, sitting in the front row with tears streaming down her face, the press conference represented both an ending and a beginning. The questions that had haunted her family for decades finally had answers, but those answers brought their own weight of knowledge about the evil that had touched their lives. The investigation into Joseph Stanley Nowakowski's life revealed a pattern of violence that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. Born in the early 1930s, he had begun his criminal career as a teenager with burglary charges in 1950. The crimes escalated through the 1960s: weapons violations, more burglaries, and increasingly violent behavior. In 1961, police had arrested him for carrying a concealed weapon. In 1966, 2 years after Catherine's murder, he was charged with another burglary. The 1973 hatchet assault on a 74-year-old woman had finally sent him to prison, but by then he had been free to commit violence for more than 2 decades. The similarities between the 1973 assault and Catherine's murder were chilling. Both victims were older women living alone. Both attacks involved multiple weapons and deliberate torture. Both crimes showed evidence of sexual assault. The 1973 victim had survived to testify against Nowakowski, describing an attacker who seemed to enjoy inflicting pain. Detective Morey began reviewing other unsolved cases from the 1960s and 1970s, looking for additional crimes that might bear Nowakowski's signature. The geographic range of his activities remained unclear, but his pattern of escalating violence suggested there might be other victims whose cases had never been solved. The media portrayed Nowakowski as a serial violent offender who had somehow evaded justice for decades. Editorial writers questioned how the criminal justice system had failed to recognize the pattern earlier, allowing a dangerous predator to remain free. The technology to connect the crimes hadn't existed in the 1960s, but hindsight revealed missed opportunities and inadequate communication between jurisdictions. Families of other unsolved murder victims began contacting police, wondering if their loved ones might have encountered the same killer. At Russell Sage College, Dr. Christina Lane used the Blackburn case as a teaching moment for her forensic science students. The classroom buzzed with excitement as she explained how modern DNA analysis had finally given voice to evidence that had been silent for decades. The handkerchief had been the key, she explained, but its secrets could only be unlocked through careful preservation of the original evidence and advances in extraction techniques that hadn't existed when the crime was committed. The students studied charts showing the degradation of DNA over time, learning how proper storage could preserve genetic material for generations. The genealogical component fascinated the students most. By comparing the killer's DNA to public ancestry databases, scientists had been able to trace his family tree back through generations, identifying potential relatives and narrowing the field of suspects. It was detective work conducted at the molecular level, using genetic markers instead of fingerprints. Several students expressed interest in careers in forensic science, inspired by the real-world impact of laboratory work. They could see how their future efforts might bring closure to families who had waited decades for answers, how science could serve justice even when traditional police work had reached its limits. The case also raised important ethical questions about privacy and genetic databases. Should law enforcement have unlimited access to ancestry information that people had submitted for genealogical research? How should society balance public safety against individual privacy rights? Dr. Lane emphasized that with great power came great responsibility. The tools they were learning to use could solve crimes and identify victims, but they also required careful consideration of constitutional protections and ethical guidelines. The students left class understanding that forensic science was not just about laboratory techniques, it was about serving justice and bringing peace to the living. For Sandy Carmichael, reading the official closure report was both a relief and a burden. 61 years after discovering her aunt's body, she finally understood what had happened in that Colony Street apartment. The report laid out the evidence in clinical detail, the DNA match, the criminal history, the pattern of violence that connected Catherine's murder to other crimes. The handkerchief that had seemed so insignificant in 1964 had carried the killer's genetic signature for more than half a century, waiting for science to develop the tools to read its message. Nowakowski had apparently used it to wipe his hands after the attack, never realizing he was leaving evidence that would eventually identify him. Sandy shared the news with surviving family members, some of whom had never known the details of Catherine's death. The revelation brought closure but also renewed grief as they confronted the reality of what Catherine had endured. The knowledge was both a gift and a curse, answers they had needed but truth they wished they could unknow. The local newspaper published a tribute to Catherine, describing her life before the murder, her work at the brush factory, her quiet independence, her kindness to neighbors. The article helped restore Catherine's identity beyond her role as a victim, reminding readers that she had been a full person with hopes and dreams that were cut short by violence. For Sandy, the solution to the case marked the beginning of a new relationship with her aunt's memory. The questions that had defined Catherine's legacy for 6 decades were finally answered, allowing the family to focus on remembering the woman rather than mourning the mystery. But justice without accountability felt incomplete. Nowakowski would never face trial, never be forced to answer for his crimes. The satisfaction of knowing his identity was tempered by the reality that he had escaped earthly punishment for his actions. Albany City Hall hosted a ceremony honoring the law enforcement officers, scientists, and students who had worked to solve Catherine Blackburn's murder. Mayor Sheehan spoke about the importance of never giving up on justice, even when decades had passed since a crime was committed. The ceremony featured displays of evidence boxes and forensic equipment, showing visitors how criminal investigations had evolved since 1964. Children from local schools toured the exhibits, learning about fingerprinting, DNA analysis, and the importance of careful evidence preservation. Detective Mori received a commendation for her dedication to cold case investigations. Dr. Lane and her students were recognized for their scientific contributions to justice. The collaboration between different agencies and institutions was held up as a model for future investigations. But the ceremony was also a reminder of work still to be done. Chief Cox announced that the Albany Police Department would be reviewing all unsolved homicides from the 1960s and 1970s, looking for cases that might benefit from modern forensic techniques. The Blackburn investigation had shown that seemingly hopeless cases could be solved with persistence and new technology. The community response was overwhelmingly positive. Residents expressed renewed confidence in law enforcement and gratitude for the dedication shown by investigators. The case had demonstrated that victims would not be forgotten, that families would not be abandoned, that truth would eventually emerge even from the deepest silence. Sandy Carmichael spoke briefly at the ceremony, thanking everyone who had worked to find answers about her aunt's death. Her words were simple but powerful. Catherine can finally rest in peace, knowing that her killer has been identified and her story has been told. District Attorney Lee Kindlon convened a regional task force to coordinate cold case investigations across multiple jurisdictions in eastern New York. The success of the Blackburn case had generated funding for new forensic analyses and encouraged other agencies to submit evidence for DNA testing. The task force included representatives from police departments, sheriff's offices, and district attorneys' offices throughout the region. Othram Laboratories agreed to prioritize cases from the consortium, potentially solving multiple decades-old crimes through advanced genetic analysis. Initial reviews identified more than 200 unsolved homicides and sexual assaults from the 1960s through 1980s that might benefit from modern forensic techniques. Evidence from these cases had been preserved with varying degrees of success, but even degraded samples might yield usable DNA profiles. The task force established protocols for evidence submission, laboratory analysis, and information sharing between agencies. They also developed guidelines for media relations and victim-family communication, learning from the Blackburn case how important it was to manage public expectations and protect family privacy. Preliminary DNA testing had already produced hits in several cases, suggesting that the region might be on the verge of solving multiple cold cases simultaneously. The prospect excited investigators but also created logistical challenges in managing multiple complex investigations with limited resources. The broader implications extended beyond individual cases. Cold case solutions could reveal patterns of criminal behavior that had been invisible when crimes were investigated separately. Serial offenders who had operated across jurisdictional boundaries might finally be identified and their full scope of criminal activity understood. Hope spread through communities that had lived with unsolved crimes for decades. Families who had given up on ever learning the truth began to believe that science might finally provide the answers they had sought for so long. Schenectady Police Department archives contained boxes of evidence from the 1973 assault that had sent Joseph Stanley Nowakowski to prison. Detective Mori and her colleagues drove to Schenectady to re-examine that evidence, looking for additional confirmation that the same man had committed both crimes. The 1973 case file contained detailed descriptions of the attack on the 74-year-old victim. Like Catherine Blackburn, she had been assaulted in her own home by an intruder who seemed to enjoy inflicting pain. The weapons used were different, a hatchet instead of heated knives, but the pattern of escalating violence was identical. Evidence from the Schenectady case included a work glove that the attacker had apparently lost during the assault, as well as a dental crown that had been knocked from his mouth during the struggle. Dental records from Nowakowski's prison intake confirmed that the crown had come from his mouth, providing additional physical evidence linking him to the crime. The comparison between the two cases strengthened the profile of Nowakowski as a serial violent offender who targeted vulnerable women. The 9-year gap between Catherine's murder and the Schenectady assault raised troubling questions about other potential victims during that period. True crime documentary producers had begun requesting interviews with investigators, hoping to create television programs about the case. Dr. Lane and Detective Mori received numerous media requests, but they remained focused on the investigation rather than publicity. The ethical questions surrounding media coverage were complex. Families deserved to have their loved ones' stories told respectfully, but sensational treatment could exploit their pain for entertainment value. The investigators worked carefully with journalists to ensure that coverage honored the victims while educating the public about forensic science advances. The Albany Police Department Evidence Vault underwent a complete modernization following the success of the Blackburn case. Detective Mori supervised the installation of new digital cataloging systems and climate-controlled storage facilities designed to preserve evidence indefinitely. Every evidence box received updated labeling with digital barcodes linked to computerized databases. Photographs were digitized and backed up to secure servers. Chain of custody records were converted to electronic format with redundant storage systems. The modernization revealed several forgotten evidence envelopes labeled pending analysis that had been stored since the 1960s and 1970s. These items had been collected during investigations but never fully processed due to technological limitations of the era. Modern forensic techniques might unlock their secrets. Young police recruits toured the evidence vault as part of their training, learning about the importance of proper evidence handling and preservation. They could see tangible proof that today's careful work might solve tomorrow's cold cases, that details mattered even when their significance wasn't immediately apparent. The vault became a symbol of continuity between past and present investigations. Officers understood that they were stewards of evidence that might not reveal its secrets for decades, that their careful work preserved possibilities for future generations of investigators. Funding for the modernization came from grants specifically designated for cold case investigations. The investment reflected growing recognition that unsolved crimes represented not just individual tragedies but systemic failures that damaged community trust in law enforcement. The new systems required additional training for officers and administrative staff, but the payoff was already evident. Evidence that had been difficult to locate and track was now instantly accessible through computer searches. The efficiency gains freed investigators to focus on analysis rather than paperwork. Dr. Christina Lane and Detective Melissa Mori co-taught a seminar at Russell Sage College on cold case investigation in the digital age. The classroom filled with students from criminal justice, forensic science, and computer science programs, all eager to learn how modern technology was revolutionizing criminal investigations. The Blackburn case served as the primary example, with detailed analysis of how genetic genealogy had succeeded where traditional police work had failed. Students studied the timeline of the investigation, examining decision points where different approaches might have led to different outcomes. One student's semester project involved cross-referencing unsolved cases from the 1960s and 1970s, looking for geographic and temporal patterns that might suggest connections between crimes. Her analysis revealed several clusters of unsolved sexual assaults in the Albany area during the years when Nowakowski was active. The research suggested possible additional victims who had never been connected to Nowakowski. The assaults showed similar patterns of excessive violence and victim selection, though none had resulted in murder. DNA evidence from those cases was being re-examined for possible matches. Media coverage of the seminar emphasized the partnership between academia and law enforcement as a model for other regions. The collaboration had produced results that neither institution could have achieved alone, combining police resources with academic research capabilities and student energy. The students left the class with a deep appreciation for the complexity of criminal investigations and the importance of interdisciplinary cooperation. Many expressed interest in careers that would allow them to continue the work of bringing justice to forgotten victims. Privacy concerns remained a topic of vigorous debate among the students. They understood the power of genetic databases to solve crimes, but they also recognized the potential for abuse if those tools were used without proper oversight and legal safeguards. Albany Rural Cemetery held a memorial service for Catherine Blackburn on a crisp October evening. Candles flickered in the gathering dusk as community members joined family members to honor her memory and mark the resolution of her case. Sandy Carmichael placed fresh flowers near Catherine's restored grave marker, which now bore a bronze plaque reading, "Case Solved, October 2025. The addition had been controversial. Some felt it inappropriate to mark a grave with references to crime, but the family had requested it as a symbol of justice. Finally achieved, Detective Mori attended the service, along with Dr. Lane and several of her students who had worked on the evidence analysis. Chief Cox spoke briefly about the importance of remembering victims as complete people, not just as subjects of criminal investigations. The candlelight vigil drew several dozen people, including neighbors who remembered Catherine from her life in North Albany. They shared stories of her kindness, her work ethic, and her quiet dignity. The service helped restore Catherine's identity beyond her role as a murder victim. But questions lingered in the autumn air. How many other victims might Nowakowski have claimed during his decades of freedom? How many families were still waiting for answers about their own tragedies? The solution to Catherine's case had opened new mysteries, even as it closed an old one. The service concluded with a moment of silence for all victims of unsolved crimes. The participants understood that Catherine's case was both an ending and a beginning, proof that justice could transcend time, but also a reminder of how much work remained undone. An anonymous letter left at the gravesite thanked the investigators for their dedication and expressed hope that other families would someday receive similar closure. The note became a symbol of the community's gratitude and its commitment to remembering those who had been lost to violence. Detective Melissa Mori sat alone in her office as evening settled over Albany. The city lights twinkled beyond her window, stretching across the Hudson Valley toward the Adirondack Mountains. On her desk, Catherine Blackburn's photograph rested beside the official case closure, documents of victim's face finally paired with her killer's name. The satisfaction of solving the case was profound, but it came with the weight of knowledge about the evil that had touched an innocent woman's life. Mori understood that justice in cold cases was always incomplete. Time could not be reversed, suffering could not be undone, and the dead could not be restored to life. But truth mattered, answers mattered. The dedication of everyone who had worked on the case, from the original investigators who had carefully preserved evidence to the students who had helped analyze it decades later, had finally given Catherine Blackburn's story its proper ending. Press clippings covered Mori's desk, chronicling the case from discovery to resolution. National news outlets had covered the story as a landmark achievement in forensic genealogy. Academic journals were preparing articles about the investigative techniques. Law enforcement agencies across the country were requesting guidance on implementing similar programs. The impact extended far beyond one solved case. Catherine Blackburn's murder had become a symbol of persistence, collaboration, and the power of science to serve justice. Her death had meaning beyond the tragedy itself. It had inspired advances in criminal investigation that would help solve other cases for generations to come. An anonymous letter had arrived that afternoon, addressed simply to the officers who solved Catherine's case. Inside, a handwritten note thanked the team for restoring faith in the justice system and for proving that victims would not be forgotten. The letter ended with a simple sentence: "Catherine can finally rest in peace." As the city settled into darkness, Mori reflected on the long journey from that September morning in 1964 to this October evening 61 years later. Time had not healed the wound of Catherine's murder, but it had finally revealed the truth. Science had remembered what human memory had forgotten, and justice had found its way home through the patient work of dedicated investigators. Catherine Blackburn's portrait smiled from the desk, no longer the face of an unsolved mystery, but the face of a woman whose story had finally been told in full. The handkerchief that had carried her killer's secrets for more than half a century had at last fulfilled its silent testimony. Justice delayed, but not denied.